It all began on a night that would shock the world forever. The streets of Paris shimmered with city lights, a backdrop of romance and glamour. But inside one of the city's most discreet hotels, a storm was quietly brewing. What truly happened on that night, the night Princess Diana's life was cut tragically short, has been the subject of whispers, speculation, and conspiracy theories for decades. But what if the stories we have been told were only half the truth? What if there were secrets buried so deep, so carefully concealed, that even the most seasoned royal correspondents were kept in the dark? Imagine for a moment being Prince Harry, Diana's son, and carrying the weight of knowledge that the public could never imagine, holding truths that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. That is exactly the position he found himself in. And now, after years of silence, he has finally spoken, revealing details that nobody expected, secrets that go straight to the heart of King Charles himself. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. We begin with the question that has haunted royal watchers for decades. What really happened on Diana's final night? The official story is familiar. A tragic car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Speeding, reckless driving, a tragic accident blamed on the paparazzi. But over the years, cracks have appeared in that narrative. Eyewitness accounts didn't always align. The timelines conflicted. Hotel staff spoke in hushed tones. Documents hinted at interventions and payments that have never been publicly confirmed. And most intriguing of all, whispers circulated that King Charles, Diana's estranged husband, may have gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure certain truths would never see the light of day. This is where Harry steps into the story, not as a passive observer, but as someone who witnessed the inner workings of the royal family, someone who carries the emotional scars, and someone now ready to expose what has been carefully hidden. Think about the magnitude of what that entails. For decades, the world believed in one narrative, a story shaped by media, controlled leaks, and the carefully maintained image of the monarchy. Millions mourned Diana, millions speculated, and millions were left with questions that went unanswered. And yet, behind palace walls, a different story was unfolding. Royal aides and staff, who were present during those crucial hours, knew details that the public would never hear. Some were sworn to secrecy. Some were reportedly compensated to stay silent. Payments were allegedly made, assurances given, all in an effort to protect an image that had been meticulously crafted over generations. Can you imagine the pressure, the fear, and the moral dilemmas these staff members faced? Would you stay silent if your conscience screamed otherwise? Prince Harry, having grown up witnessing both the public adoration and private tensions that surrounded his mother, understood the weight of secrecy from a young age. He saw firsthand the emotional toll it took on Diana, on the staff, and on the family itself. He understood the delicate dance of loyalty, of maintaining appearances, of keeping painful truths under wraps. But as time went on, as the world changed and documents surfaced, as whispers turned into tangible evidence, Harry began to see that silence was no longer an option. The world needed to know, not to settle scores, but to honor the truth of his mother's life and death. And when he finally spoke, the revelations he shared didn't just shock the public. They sent tremors through the very foundations of the monarchy. What makes this story so compelling, so urgent, is the combination of personal trauma and institutional secrecy. We are talking about a mother's tragic end, a son's lifelong burden, and a father's controversial decisions. We are talking about a palace willing to go to extraordinary lengths to maintain an image, including silencing those who knew the truth firsthand. And we are talking about the courage it takes for a single individual, even a prince, to step forward against centuries of tradition and expectation. This isn't just royal gossip. This is a deeply human story of grief, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of truth. It forces us to ask questions about loyalty, morality, and the lengths people will go to protect power. In revealing these secrets, Harry has not only challenged his father, but also the entire institution of the monarchy. He exposed a world where appearances often outweigh reality, where image is more sacred than honesty, and where those who dare to speak can face consequences that ripple far beyond personal relationships. And yet, Harry's revelations are not merely about scandal. They are about clarity. They are about understanding what really happened on that night in Paris and why the truth has been obscured for so long. He shines a light into corners that have been dark for decades, illuminating actions, decisions, and behaviors that the public was never meant to see. As we explore this story, we must confront uncomfortable questions. Why would anyone attempt to silence witnesses to a tragedy? What does it say about power when loyalty is bought rather than earned? How do these actions shape the legacy of those involved, including Diana, Charles, and Harry himself? These are not abstract questions. They strike at the very heart of how institutions handle truth and accountability. They make us rethink what we believed we knew about the royal family, about the events of that fateful night, and about the dynamics of secrecy and power that define one of the most famous families in the world. And while the details Harry has revealed are shocking in themselves, the most chilling aspect may be the methodical way in which silence was maintained. We are talking about coordinated efforts, hush agreements, carefully timed statements, and the intricate workings of a system designed to protect the image of the monarchy at any cost. Think about it. Staff who witnessed key moments, who understood the gravity of what occurred, were reportedly given assurances, financial and otherwise, to remain silent. The psychological weight of such an arrangement is almost unimaginable. Imagine knowing a truth that could redefine history, yet being told that speaking it aloud could destroy your life, or worse, destabilize an institution centuries in the making. But what makes Harry's revelations even more gripping is the personal lens through which he tells the story. This is not just a historical account. It is a narrative colored by decades of grief, love, fear, and moral conflict. It is the voice of a son grappling with the loss of a mother and the realization that those around him, even within his own family, may have been complicit in keeping critical truths hidden. His perspective humanizes the events, forcing us to confront not only the scandal, but also the emotional devastation that lingers long after the public headlines have faded. And yet, for all the heartbreak and controversy, there is a sense of urgency that permeates Harry's account. This is why he chose now to speak out. The world is changing. Information is leaking through channels that cannot be easily controlled, and the pressure for transparency is greater than ever. The public, long fascinated by the monarchy, now has a reason to listen not just to tabloid speculation, but to first-hand accounts from someone who lived at the center of this story. It is a narrative that demands attention, a story that promises revelations, and a journey into secrets that have been buried too long. So as we begin this exploration, we must ask ourselves, what is the full truth of Diana's final night? And how deep does the web of secrecy really go? What was King Charles's role in orchestrating silence? And what were the consequences for those who witnessed the events firsthand? How did Harry navigate a childhood shadowed by grief and secrecy? And what compelled him to finally break the silence? These are the questions we will explore in detail, chapter by chapter, revealing truths that have remained hidden for decades. And just when you think you have grasped the full story, just when you believe you understand the dynamics of that fateful night, there is another layer, another revelation waiting to be uncovered. The story does not end with Diana's death or with media speculation. It extends into the hidden corridors of power, into whispered conversations behind palace doors, into decisions that shaped the very narrative of one of the most iconic families in history. And it is here, in these unseen moments, that the most shocking secrets reside. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What really happened on the night Princess Diana's life was cut tragically short. Was it simply a fatal accident, or was there something more sinister lurking behind the polished facade of the monarchy? As Paris shimmered with city lights on that fateful evening, few could have imagined that history was about to be written in tragedy, secrecy, and scandal. The streets were alive with the usual rhythm of late-night life. Taxis weaving through traffic, couples strolling along the Seine, the soft glow of lamplights reflecting off the river. But inside the walls of the Ritz Hotel, a different kind of tension was brewing. Behind closed doors, the glitter of wealth and royalty masked a web of fear, anxiety, and unspoken truths. What unfolded that night would not only shock the world, but also set in motion a cascade of secrets, silenced witnesses, and unanswered questions that would haunt the royal family for decades. Imagine walking through those hotel corridors as a staff member, knowing the eyes of the world would soon turn here, but also understanding that certain things must never be revealed. Staff whispered in hushed tones, some glancing nervously at each other, aware that they carried knowledge that could destabilize one of the oldest monarchies in the world. And then there was Diana, the people's princess, radiant yet vulnerable, moving through the hotel with the grace and poise that had made her an icon. But on that night, behind her signature smile and impeccably styled appearance, lay a storm of worry, exhaustion, and perhaps premonition. Had she sensed that the world was closing in, not with admiration but with the weight of judgment, speculation, and control? We often hear the phrase, a tragic accident. But what does that truly mean in the context of Diana's final night? Reports have long pointed to a combination of reckless driving, high speed, and paparazzi pursuit. Yet the accounts from hotel staff, friends, and witnesses are riddled with contradictions. Who exactly was present? Who was informed of her movements? And, crucially, were there efforts behind the scenes to manipulate the narrative in the hours and days that followed? It's in these contradictions that the seeds of controversy take root. Prince Harry, having grown up in the shadow of these events, always felt the tension between what was presented publicly and what he knew privately. What he has now revealed goes far beyond the well-known headlines. It delves into the calculated decisions, hush arrangements, and palace interventions that occurred while the world mourned. Picture, if you can, the frenzy outside the Ritz Hotel. Paparazzi cameras clicking incessantly, a swarm of flashes capturing fleeting moments of movement. Each snapshot telling a story, yet only part of it, filtered and framed to shape public perception. Inside, Diana moved with a quiet determination, trying to navigate the pressures of fame, expectations, and personal safety. And yet, even in that controlled environment, there were vulnerabilities. Friends have recounted that she appeared tense, unusually preoccupied, and acutely aware of the eyes that followed her every move. This tension, subtle but palpable, would soon escalate into a crisis that changed lives forever. As the night progressed, those in close proximity witnessed events that would later become critical pieces of the puzzle. Staff members, whose names would rarely appear in the headlines, observed interactions that were both routine and extraordinary. Security protocols, private discussions, and instructions that were cryptic and often contradictory. Some were told to remain alert. Some were asked to ensure certain information never left the premises, and others were reportedly offered incentives to maintain silence. These dynamics create a complex tapestry of loyalty, fear, and obligation, leaving room for speculation about the motivations of those in power. How far would someone go to protect a reputation or an institution, even at the expense of truth? Meanwhile, Diana's companions for the evening played their own roles in a story that has been meticulously reconstructed over years. Who was with her, and what were they told? What pressures were placed upon them to adhere to a certain narrative? These are not just questions of logistics. They are questions of morality, accountability, and the human cost of secrecy. Harry's later revelations would make it clear that even small decisions, seemingly insignificant at the time, had profound consequences for the unfolding of events. Each choice, each instruction, each whispered warning contributed to the environment that made tragedy not just possible, but, in many ways, inevitable. As the hours wore on, Diana and her entourage moved through Paris with the city as both a backdrop and a participant in the unfolding drama. The choices made that night, where to go, whom to see, how to travel, were influenced by a mix of personal desire, security advice, and unseen pressures from the royal establishment. And lurking beneath it all was a network of individuals who had a stake in controlling information, shaping perception, and protecting certain interests. This is where the story takes on a darker, almost cinematic quality. Layers of tension, loyalty, fear, and moral compromise converging in a moment that would leave the world stunned. But it wasn't just the immediate events of that night that mattered. It was what followed. The aftermath, the narrative carefully presented to the public, and the people whose lives were touched by the tragedy all became part of a story that was larger than any single individual. Harry's perspective, as someone intimately connected to both the personal loss and the institutional mechanisms at play, sheds new light on the complexity of the situation. His account exposes the contrast between public mourning and private management, between grief and control, between human emotion and royal protocol. What makes this chapter of history so compelling is not only the tragedy itself, but the human stories embedded within it. Hotel staff, bodyguards, companions, and palace aides each played roles that were both visible and hidden. They navigated competing pressures, balancing personal conscience against professional obligation. Some made decisions out of fear, some out of loyalty, and some under direct instruction to protect information at all costs. Harry's revelations force us to confront the ethical and emotional weight carried by those who were present, raising questions that extend beyond the specifics of Diana's death to broader themes of power, morality, and responsibility. And yet, for all the planning, secrecy, and management, there were cracks in the facade. Witnesses have described moments of confusion, unexpected interactions, and decisions that, in hindsight, seem eerily prescient or disturbingly consequential. Each fragment of observation, each whispered instruction, each unexplained action adds depth to a story that has captivated the world for decades. What was intended to be a contained evening of discretion and privacy ultimately became a nexus of chaos, speculation, and revelation. By the time Diana left the Ritz Hotel, the trajectory of history had shifted. The events that followed, the car crash, the media frenzy, the palace's response, and the global mourning, were all shaped by decisions made in those hours. Harry's insights now illuminate the hidden mechanics behind what many believe to be an unavoidable accident. Through his eyes, we see a pattern of control, influence, and intervention that raises unsettling questions about the role of power in personal tragedy. How much of what happened was fate, and how much was orchestrated by human hands determined to protect image over truth? And just as the night in Paris ended, leaving the world to grieve, the seeds of secrecy had already been sown. Staff would be instructed to remain silent. Payments would allegedly be made to ensure loyalty. The official narrative would be carefully curated and broadcast to the world. But the truth, as Harry reveals, cannot be contained forever. There are always cracks, always witnesses, always a moment when silence is broken and reality emerges. In the shadows of that night, in the corridors of the Ritz, and within the halls of power, decisions were being made that would ripple across decades. Every choice carried weight. Every action, intentional or not, would influence how Diana's legacy was remembered. And through it all, Prince Harry carried the knowledge, the grief, and the questions that would eventually compel him to speak, to reveal what had long been hidden. But even as we piece together the events of that night, even as the details become clearer, one fact remains undeniable. The world was not prepared for the secrets that were about to emerge, the revelations that would challenge perceptions, and the personal courage it would take for a son to confront the father he once trusted. The night that shook the world had only just begun to reveal its true impact. And yet, the most shocking truths were still hidden, waiting to surface. The decisions made by King Charles, the payments to staff, the instructions to remain silent. All of these elements were pieces of a puzzle that would not fully come together until decades later, when Harry finally broke his silence. What he uncovered not only reshaped the narrative of that night, but also cast a new light on the monarchy, power, and the human cost of secrecy. But what came next, as Harry would soon reveal, was even more shocking, and it would leave the world questioning everything it thought it knew about Diana, her death, and the man who would one day be king. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy that it shapes every thought, every decision, and every relationship in your life? For Prince Harry, that secret wasn't just personal. It was a legacy, a burden intertwined with the public fascination surrounding his mother, Princess Diana, and the monarchy itself. From the moment he first became aware of the scrutiny surrounding his family, Harry was forced to navigate a world where appearances were everything, and truths were often dangerous. Imagine growing up under the glare of relentless media attention, knowing that your every move would be dissected, analyzed, and judged. But worse than the paparazzi, worse than the public obsession, was the knowledge of hidden truths, details about Diana's final night, the palace's attempts to manage perception, and the silencing of those who knew too much. These were not mere stories. These were intimate realities, and as he matured, the weight of them became nearly unbearable. Harry's childhood was punctuated by moments of stark contrast. On one hand, there was the fairy tale world of palaces, state ceremonies, and royal privilege. On the other hand, there was the very human grief of losing a mother and the troubling awareness that certain adults, figures of authority, figures of trust, were complicit in shaping narratives that obscured truth. Imagine being a child, aware that the world adored your mother, yet realizing that those closest to you might have prioritized image over honesty, control over compassion. The conflict was relentless. How to honor Diana's memory while simultaneously navigating the complex, often suffocating rules of a family devoted to maintaining appearances. In recounting his burden, Harry doesn't just focus on grief. He details the constant tension between personal loyalty and moral clarity. From a young age, he observed his father, King Charles, balancing public duty with private discretion. While the world saw a composed, dignified figure, Harry began to notice inconsistencies, words that didn't align with actions, reassurances that contradicted behavior, and moments of avoidance when sensitive subjects arose. These early observations planted seeds of doubt, questions about loyalty, and a lingering sense of injustice. What did it mean to belong to a family where silence was more valued than honesty? How could he reconcile the love he felt for his father with the suspicion and unease that shadowed every conversation about his mother? Even the simplest moments carried emotional weight. School days, public appearances, and private interactions were all colored by the knowledge that certain truths could not be spoken. Friends might notice moments of sorrow or tension, but they could never fully comprehend the intricacies of palace life. For Harry, laughter and childhood play were intertwined with observation and internal reckoning. Each glance from an adult, each whisper overheard, contributed to a growing understanding that the world outside the palace gates did not know, and perhaps could never know, the real story of Diana's life and her tragic death. The most critical aspect of Harry's perspective, however, is his understanding of the stakes. These weren't merely family secrets. They were matters that could influence public perception, international media narratives, and even the stability of the monarchy itself. When staff were allegedly paid to remain silent about Diana's final hours, Harry felt the tension between the right to truth and the weight of institutional loyalty. This is not a distant, abstract dilemma. It's deeply personal. How do you honor the memory of a mother when doing so risks alienating a father, a family, and a centuries-old institution? The moral calculus is brutal, the emotional stakes incalculable. Harry's reflections reveal contradictions that make the story all the more compelling. On one hand, there was genuine grief and longing for familial connection. On the other, there was growing awareness of cover-ups and deliberate obfuscation. He witnessed firsthand the delicate negotiations, the whispered instructions, the veiled warnings, and the subtle strategies employed to manage perception. These contradictions created internal conflict. How could one reconcile the love for a father with the awareness of actions that compromised morality and truth? How could one balance respect for tradition with the urgency of speaking out? These questions haunted Harry long before he decided to reveal the secrets to the world. Moreover, Harry's burden was amplified by public expectations. The world projected onto him the image of a prince shaped by tragedy, grief-stricken, dutiful, cautious. Yet internally, he grappled with anger, confusion, and moral outrage. Witnessing the silencing of staff who had intimate knowledge of Diana's final night, seeing how narratives were curated, and understanding the extent to which his father may have been involved, created an emotional tension that was impossible to ignore. How do you process grief when grief itself has been politicized? How do you honor a parent when doing so exposes institutional failings? These are not rhetorical questions. They were lived experiences that defined Harry's youth and adulthood. Another layer of complexity emerges when we consider the psychological toll. The burden of knowing, the necessity of discretion, and the constant moral calculations left Harry with little room for typical adolescent development. While peers navigated ordinary childhood challenges, he faced the emotional ramifications of secrecy, the weight of family legacy, and the haunting knowledge of what might have been preventable or concealed. The tension between internal morality and external expectation shaped his personality, his decision-making, and ultimately, the trajectory that led him to finally speak publicly about what he knew. And yet, despite the weight of this burden, Harry's perspective is not solely defined by trauma. There is resilience, courage, and a commitment to truth that threads through his narrative. He illustrates how, even within highly controlled environments, individuals can choose integrity over convenience. This is particularly striking when contrasted with the alleged behavior of those who prioritize the preservation of reputation over honesty. The emotional spikes are palpable. Grief intertwined with moral clarity, anger tempered by compassion, and personal loyalty challenged by ethical imperatives. This interplay makes Harry's account gripping, not just as royal revelation, but as a deeply human story of courage and consequence. Throughout his reflections, Harry also poses subtle questions to the audience, asking us to consider our own responses in similar circumstances. What would you do if the truth you carried could hurt someone you love, but hiding it would betray your conscience? How much loyalty is owed to institution versus family versus morality? These rhetorical inquiries deepen engagement, inviting the audience to internalize the stakes, making the story not just about royal scandal, but about universal human dilemmas. And as we continue to trace Harry's perspective, it becomes clear that the burden was never just about secrecy. It was about timing. Speaking too early could have devastating personal consequences. Speaking too late might allow false narratives to become cemented. The tension of waiting, of calculating when and how to reveal the truth, adds an additional layer of suspense and urgency. Harry's eventual decision to come forward was not impulsive. It was the culmination of years of observation, emotional reckoning, and a commitment to honoring his mother's memory. The contradictions, the emotional turmoil, and the strategic considerations all converge to explain why Harry's revelations are so shocking. They are not merely sensational. They are the product of a lived experience marked by grief, secrecy, and ethical complexity. Through his eyes, the audience begins to understand not just the events of Diana's final night, but the intricate web of decisions, silences, and pressures that surrounded it. And as Harry recounts these experiences, the story begins to foreshadow the explosive revelations about King Charles himself. Payments made to ensure silence, instructions given to staff, and a calculated effort to control narratives. These elements, when finally revealed, refract the entire tragedy in a new light, forcing the public to reconsider previously held assumptions and perceptions. But even with all this insight, there is one question that hangs over Harry's account like a shadow. How does one reconcile love and respect for a father with the knowledge of actions that compromise truth, morality, and perhaps even justice? This is the tension that drives not just his story, but the narrative of the monarchy itself, a tension that will only intensify as the secrets he has uncovered come to light. And just when you think you understand the full weight of his burden, just when you believe you have grasped the emotional and moral stakes, another layer emerges. One that ties directly to the unseen witnesses, the silenced staff, and the alleged payments that sought to maintain secrecy. The story is far from complete, and the next revelations will bring us closer to understanding the lengths to which the monarchy went to manage the fallout from that night. But what Harry uncovered about his father's role in orchestrating silence would shock even the most loyal royal watchers, and the world was about to see just how deep the secrets ran. Have you ever wondered what it's like to be caught in the crossfire of history while being sworn to silence? To witness events that could redefine the narrative of one of the most powerful families in the world, yet knowing you cannot speak without risking everything? For the staff who served Princess Diana during her final days, this was a chilling reality. These were individuals who moved silently through the gilded halls of power, bearing witness to moments that would later fuel decades of speculation, grief, and scandal. Their lives were entwined with the monarchy's most intimate secrets, and their loyalty was tested in ways that few outside palace walls could ever imagine. Some were professionals who prided themselves on discretion. Others were close aides, trusted confidants, and friends of Diana herself. All were bound by an invisible, yet unbreakable, chain of obligation. They knew too much, and they were expected to know nothing. From the moment Diana checked into the Ritz Hotel that night, the staff became silent observers of a story that the world would never fully understand. Some had been briefed by the palace on how to handle inquiries, how to control the flow of information, and even how to manage the princess's movements. Others were left in the dark, aware only that certain instructions were non-negotiable. Imagine the stress, the tension, the constant vigilance required to navigate these unspoken rules. Every glance, every word, every action had consequences. Mistakes could lead not only to professional reprimand, but also to personal exposure, scandal, or even legal entanglement. The stakes were astonishingly high. Many of the staff later recounted moments of confusion and fear. Who could they trust? Which instructions were genuine, and which were designed to mislead? The palace, after all, operated on a system of hierarchy, loyalty, and control. And at the center of it all was a message that resonated clearly. Protect the family's image at all costs, even if that meant withholding truth from the public, or even from history itself. The tension between moral responsibility and professional duty created an environment of constant psychological strain. How do you reconcile the need for truth with the orders to remain silent? What do you do when your conscience conflicts with a centuries-old institution? Consider the whispers about payments and incentives allegedly offered to ensure compliance. While the exact details remain shrouded in secrecy, multiple sources have hinted that financial arrangements were made to secure the silence of those who had intimate knowledge of Diana's last hours. These were not trivial sums. They were calculated, strategic, and designed to make speaking out financially and personally prohibitive. Staff members were caught in a moral bind. Loyalty to their employer demanded discretion, but loyalty to truth, and, more importantly, to the memory of a beloved princess, pulled them in the opposite direction. How would you respond in such a situation? Would you accept the compromise, or risk everything to reveal what you knew? The story becomes even more compelling when you realize that these staff members were not merely passive observers. Many had unique insights into the dynamics between Diana and the royal family. They witnessed private interactions, subtle tensions, and moments of vulnerability that the world would never see. They saw a princess who was constantly under scrutiny, a woman navigating love, fear, and public expectation simultaneously. And they also saw the mechanisms of control at work. The subtle interventions, the whispered directives, the quiet efforts to shape perception. Every action taken by the staff, whether out of loyalty, fear, or duty, contributed to a carefully orchestrated environment in which truth could be managed, manipulated, or outright concealed. What makes their perspective particularly shocking is the interplay between human emotion and institutional pressure. Staff often described a paradoxical environment. Intimate access to a woman who was vibrant, loving, and deeply human, juxtaposed against a system that prioritized image, control, and secrecy above all else. They were witnesses to history, yet constrained by protocols that demanded invisibility. They were entrusted with care and discretion, yet burdened with knowledge that could destabilize the very structure they served. The emotional stakes were enormous. They were constantly balancing compassion with fear, empathy with obligation, loyalty with morality. And while the public narrative painted a picture of a princess tragically taken too soon, the behind-the-scenes reality was far more complex. Staff members observed behaviors, instructions, and interventions that suggested layers of premeditation and strategy, especially in the aftermath of Diana's accident. Some described moments where instructions seemed designed not for safety or clarity, but for control of narrative, control of perception, control of memory. These details, subtle yet significant, add a layer of intrigue that complicates the story of that night, suggesting that events may have been guided as much by institutional concern as by circumstance. Harry's revelations shine a spotlight on these unseen witnesses, giving voice to their experiences for the first time. He underscores the human cost of their silence, revealing the pressure, guilt, and moral conflict they endured. Some of these staff members feared losing their livelihoods, others feared being ostracized, and a few, according to Harry, feared for their personal safety if they spoke. The combination of fear, loyalty, and obligation created a perfect storm of silence, allowing narratives to be shaped by those in power while the truth remained obscured. But even within this environment of coercion and control, there were moments of quiet defiance, small acts of honesty, and fleeting glimpses of moral courage. Certain staff members reportedly pushed boundaries, questioned instructions, and struggled internally with the ethical implications of their roles. These moments, though rare and often hidden, hint at a tension that runs through the entire story, a tension between obedience and conscience, between self-preservation and the pursuit of truth. It is this tension that Harry's revelations bring to light, showing the audience not only the secrets of the royal family, but also the human struggles of those caught in the middle. The emotional beats of this chapter are impossible to ignore. Imagine carrying knowledge that could alter history, yet being forbidden to speak. Imagine the weight of grief, compounded by the pressure to maintain silence. The staff's experiences are both relatable and extraordinary, humanizing a situation that otherwise could seem distant or abstract. Their dilemmas echo our own moral questions. When is loyalty to an institution justified, and when does it become complicity? How far would you go to protect a narrative, and at what cost to truth? And then there is the chilling realization of the alleged payments and instructions themselves. These were not casual suggestions. They were deliberate, methodical, and designed to shape reality in real time. Staff who observed or understood key aspects of Diana's final night were reportedly incentivized to remain silent, creating an ethical and emotional dilemma that few could navigate successfully. Harry's perspective highlights the psychological impact of this environment, showing how the pressures of secrecy, loyalty, and morality converge to create an experience that is as haunting as it is complex. The contradictions in the staff accounts further intensify the intrigue. Some describe unwavering loyalty to Diana. Others recall fear-driven compliance with palace instructions. Some hint at financial inducements. Others focus on subtle social pressures. Taken together, these narratives paint a picture of a highly controlled, morally ambiguous environment in which truth was a negotiable commodity. And yet, the human dimension remained central. The staff were not villains, nor were they heroes. They were individuals caught in an impossible situation, doing what they could to navigate the competing pressures around them. Finally, we must consider the broader implications of these revelations. The stories of the staff, when combined with Harry's first-hand accounts, reveal an environment in which secrecy was institutionalized, loyalty was monetized, and truth was subordinated to image. It is a system that, while designed to protect the monarchy, also imposed immense moral and emotional costs on those within its sphere. Understanding their experiences is crucial not only for understanding Diana's final night, but also for appreciating the psychological and ethical dynamics that permeate one of the most famous families in the world. And just when you think you have grasped the full scope of the staff's experiences, just when the layers of secrecy and pressure seem insurmountable, the story takes an even darker turn. Allegations emerge that the orchestrated silence extended beyond mere instructions or financial arrangements. It involved deliberate actions by those in power to ensure that key details of Diana's final night would never reach the public eye. This brings us closer to understanding not just the tragedy itself, but the mechanisms of control, influence, and manipulation that Harry would later expose, forcing the world to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, morality, and the cost of silence. But what one staff member eventually revealed, breaking decades of silence, would shock the world and expose a level of orchestration that nobody expected, and the implications would ripple far beyond the palace walls. What if the story of Diana's final night wasn't just about tragedy, grief, and paparazzi chaos, but also about a carefully orchestrated effort to control every detail after the fact? What if powerful hands had ensured that key witnesses remained silent, not out of loyalty, but through calculated compensation? These are the revelations Prince Harry has now brought to light, shining a spotlight on a system designed to protect the monarchy at nearly any cost. Central to this narrative is the notion of hush payments, monetary incentives allegedly offered to royal staff to prevent them from speaking about Diana's final hours. What did these payments reveal about the inner workings of power? How far was King Charles willing to go to maintain control of the narrative? And what does it say about the lengths institutions will take to preserve image over truth? The allegations, though long whispered in royal circles, gain a new, chilling clarity when viewed through Harry's perspective. He recounts conversations with staff members who had been directly approached with offers to remain silent, sometimes framed as loyalty payments, sometimes as compensation for discretion. These were not casual gestures. They were meticulously structured, with the unspoken understanding that deviation could carry severe consequences. Imagine being in a position where the truth you know could redefine history, yet someone offers you money, prestige, or even your livelihood in exchange for silence. It is a moral conundrum of extraordinary gravity. What would you do? According to Harry, these payments were not a matter of rumor. They were documented, tracked, and administered in ways designed to ensure compliance. The ledger, whether physical or digital, recorded amounts, recipients, and terms. Each entry tells a story, a narrative of power exercised with surgical precision. Staff who once whispered among themselves about inconsistencies in the official story found themselves confronted not only with moral dilemmas, but also with the tangible weight of financial inducement. This is a stark demonstration of how institutions, even royal households, can use economic leverage to shape behavior and control narratives. Consider the psychological impact on those receiving these payments. On one hand, they were materially rewarded, which could ease immediate fears and provide a sense of security. On the other hand, they were complicit in concealing truths that weighed heavily on their conscience. Harry describes the burden staff carried, a duality of relief and guilt that often manifested in stress, insomnia, and a pervasive sense of unease. Some staff members would later reveal that they constantly feared exposure, not only of the events they witnessed, but also of their participation in the orchestrated silence. Their lives became a delicate balancing act: comply, conceal, survive. The broader implications of these payments cannot be overstated. They suggest an institutional prioritization of image over morality, a calculated effort to manage the historical record in real time. Every dollar, every signed agreement, every veiled threat reinforced the notion that certain truths were too dangerous, too destabilizing, to be allowed into public consciousness. Harry frames these actions as emblematic of a system in which the monarchy's legacy takes precedence over individual lives, even those of close family members and trusted aides. The moral tension is palpable. How do you reconcile the desire for transparency with the entrenched mechanisms of power? Harry also recounts the contradictions inherent in this system. Staff were encouraged to show compassion and care to Diana, yet simultaneously expected to maintain silence about critical events. They were praised for loyalty, yet punished subtly or overtly for deviating from instructions. The payments, while offering temporary compliance, could never fully erase the ethical dilemmas staff faced. Every transaction was a reminder. Silence came at a cost, one that could never be measured purely in financial terms. It carried psychological, emotional, and even spiritual consequences. What makes this chapter even more gripping is the contrast between the public narrative and the private reality. While the world mourned Diana and debated the circumstances of her death, a quiet network of financial arrangements operated in the shadows, keeping key details from reaching journalists, historians, or even family members. The idea of a ledger, a record of hush payments, adds an almost cinematic quality to the events, suggesting deliberate orchestration and meticulous planning. Harry describes reviewing some of these documents, noting the precise language, the careful timing, and the unmistakable intent to control information. And yet, for all the planning, the system was imperfect. Staff members were human, and human behavior is notoriously difficult to predict. Some questioned the morality of their actions. Others struggled with anxiety over potential leaks. A few began keeping their own notes, their own mental records, aware that the truth could not remain buried forever. These small cracks in the system of control were critical. They provided the openings through which Harry eventually gained insight into the scope and scale of the hush payments. The narrative of secrecy was not absolute. It was vulnerable to exposure, and Harry's persistence would eventually exploit those vulnerabilities. The ledger also reveals patterns in behavior and decision-making that are deeply revealing. Certain staff members were prioritized for compensation based on their proximity to critical events. Others were incentivized according to the sensitivity of the information they possessed. The scale of these payments, when aggregated, points to a systematic, strategic effort to manage knowledge and influence outcomes. Harry emphasizes that this was not a matter of simple discretion. It was a high-stakes operation involving ethical compromises, financial enticements, and institutional authority. This chapter of the story also highlights the human consequences of such arrangements. Staff who accepted payments were not merely executing instructions. They were living with the moral repercussions. Some described sleepless nights, lingering guilt, and a persistent sense of unease, realizing that the truth they held could have profoundly altered public understanding of Diana's death. These are not abstract consequences. They are the lived experiences of individuals caught between loyalty, survival, and conscience. Harry's account gives voice to these struggles, turning what might otherwise be a dry financial record into a story of emotional depth, ethical complexity, and profound human drama. And while the payments themselves are shocking, they are only one part of a larger web of influence. Harry also reveals how the ledger was intertwined with broader strategies, instructions to manipulate public perception, to guide media narratives, and to ensure that key witnesses maintain silence. Financial inducements were reinforced by social pressures, threats of career consequences, and subtle signaling of potential ostracism. Staff were effectively cornered into complicity, navigating a labyrinth where every decision carried personal and professional risk. The moral contradictions of this system are stark. On one hand, the staff were encouraged to care for Diana, to support her in her final hours. On the other, they were simultaneously bound by secrecy, pressured to conceal truths that were morally significant. Harry describes the emotional weight of watching this unfold, aware that the people around him were trapped in a system that demanded obedience at the expense of conscience. It is a story of human vulnerability colliding with institutional power, a tension that amplifies the tragedy of Diana's final night. And just when it seems that the ledger represents the ultimate form of control, another layer emerges. According to Harry, some payments were not just transactional. They were symbolic, a reminder that loyalty to the monarchy came at the cost of personal integrity. The implications are staggering. Not only does this reveal a calculated effort to influence behavior, but it also exposes a culture in which financial leverage is wielded to shape historical narrative. The emotional stakes, for both staff and family members, were immense. But the most shocking revelation comes when Harry details the instructions associated with these payments. Explicit directions to remain silent about key moments, including details of Diana's interactions, her emotional state, and the decisions made in the critical hours leading up to her death. The payments were not mere incentives. They were tools of control, mechanisms to ensure that certain truths never reached the public eye. And as Harry explains, this level of orchestration is unprecedented, revealing a darker, more calculated dimension to the palace's management of events than anyone outside those walls could have imagined. Yet, even in the midst of this controlled environment, cracks appeared. Staff who carried knowledge began to communicate cautiously, diaries were kept, and memories were preserved, waiting for a moment when disclosure could occur. These small acts of defiance, coupled with Harry's persistence and determination, eventually culminated in revelations that rocked the world, exposing the intersection of power, secrecy, and morality at the heart of the monarchy. And just when you think the full scope of the ledger and its implications has been revealed, there is another shock waiting, a level of coordination and foresight that demonstrates the lengths to which King Charles allegedly went to ensure silence, protect reputation, and shape the story that would reach the world. What Harry uncovered about these payments was more than a financial record. It was a roadmap to understanding the complex, morally fraught machinery that operated behind palace doors. But the true extent of this orchestration, and its consequences for those who dared to witness or question it, would not be fully understood until the next layer of revelations came to light, exposing even deeper secrets than anyone could have imagined. How does a personal tragedy become a global spectacle? How does the death of a beloved princess transform into a media storm so intense that even those closest to her struggle to discern truth from manipulation? For Princess Diana, her final night was not only a private calamity, it was a public event, dissected, analyzed, and sensationalized by a press eager for answers, revelations, and scandal. The world watched, transfixed, as the story unfolded in real time. Yet few understood the subtle, deliberate misdirection that shaped what the public saw. And behind it all, according to Prince Harry, there was more than just sensational reporting. There was orchestration, a calculated interplay between palace officials, strategic leaks, and carefully timed narratives designed to control perception. From the moment the crash was reported, the media descended upon Paris with a ferocity unlike anything seen before. Paparazzi cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every fleeting moment, while news outlets broadcast speculation, eyewitness accounts, and half-truths to a world hungry for answers. Headlines screamed tragedy, blame, and mystery. The People's Princess lost. Fatal crash in Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Paparazzi chase or accident. Every story carried an emotional spike, a dramatic hook, and a sense of urgency, drawing the public deeper into the narrative. But what most readers didn't realize was that not all of these stories were organically sourced. Some were subtly guided, intentionally framed, and strategically released to shape interpretation before facts could emerge. Harry's perspective sheds light on a crucial dynamic: the tension between genuine journalistic inquiry and manipulation. While some reporters worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, others became unwitting instruments of palace strategy. Leaks, oblique statements, and selective disclosures were sometimes planted, not maliciously by the journalists themselves, but by those who controlled access, information, and the timing of revelations. Think about it. What happens when a son confronts a father not just about family, but about decades of secrets, silenced voices, and orchestrated narratives? Prince Harry's confrontation with the palace was more than a personal reckoning. It was a seismic challenge to an institution built on tradition, discretion, and control. Imagine standing in the shadow of centuries of monarchy, confronting the very people whose decisions shaped your mother's tragic death, and demanding accountability. The emotional stakes were staggering, the tension nearly unbearable, and the consequences potentially monumental. Harry's decision to speak out was neither impulsive nor simple. It was the culmination of years of observation, grief, and moral reckoning. The confrontation was not a single moment. It was a series of encounters, subtle negotiations, and carefully measured challenges. Harry describes feeling the weight of both love and anger. Love, because despite the failures he perceived, his father was still his father. Anger, because he had witnessed firsthand decisions that prioritized reputation over truth, control over compassion. How does one navigate such a labyrinth of emotions while also confronting an institution that demands loyalty, discretion, and obedience? The answer, as Harry reveals, was a painstaking combination of courage, patience, and strategic calculation. From the beginning, Harry knew the stakes. Speaking too aggressively risked alienation, career sabotage, and public misrepresentation. Remaining silent, however, allowed injustice and secrecy to persist. He was acutely aware that every word, gesture, and decision would be scrutinized, not only by the royal family, but by the global public, the media, and historians who would eventually analyze every detail. It was a high-wire act, balancing moral obligation against personal safety, loyalty, and the legacy of his mother. The confrontations themselves varied in tone. Some were quiet and measured, conversations held behind closed doors with a veneer of diplomacy. Others were heated, emotionally charged, and fraught with moral tension. Harry recalls moments where words were exchanged with a mixture of desperation and clarity, as he attempted to reconcile the reality of his mother's final hours with the palace's portrayal of events. Each exchange was a test of endurance, strategy, and emotional intelligence. How do you hold someone accountable for decades of secrecy while maintaining the possibility of reconciliation? Central to these confrontations was the issue of truth versus perception. Harry was demanding acknowledgement of hidden actions, the hush payments, the silenced staff, the controlled narratives, and the decisions that obscured critical details about Diana's final night. King Charles, like any leader of an institution, responded with a combination of deflection, justification, and selective acknowledgement. The tension between these approaches created both friction and emotional intensity. Harry describes moments when he felt unheard, misunderstood, or even betrayed, intensifying the gravity of the confrontation. What makes this chapter particularly compelling is the human element. Beyond the institutional and strategic dimensions, there is raw emotion. Grief, frustration, love, and moral outrage intertwined in a volatile mix. Harry's recounting emphasizes the weight of familial bonds, the difficulty of challenging authority figures, and the emotional turbulence of confronting someone both personally and symbolically significant. The narrative illustrates that this was not merely a political or institutional confrontation. It was profoundly personal, resonating deeply with his own experiences of loss, secrecy, and responsibility. Harry also details the contradictions he encountered in these exchanges. On one hand, there were assurances of care, concern, and acknowledgement of past errors. On the other, there were repeated attempts to redirect, minimize, or rationalize decisions that had profound ethical implications. These contradictions created a sense of moral dissonance that Harry found particularly challenging. He was forced to navigate a landscape where words and actions often diverged, and where the public facade of duty and concern masked deeper strategic considerations. The confrontation extended beyond private conversations. Harry had to contend with advisors, intermediaries, and palace staff who acted as buffers between him and the decision-makers. Each interaction added complexity, creating layers of negotiation, miscommunication, and subtle influence. Staff, aware of the stakes, often attempted to mediate or control the narrative, which in turn heightened Harry's sense of urgency and frustration. The result was a dynamic environment in which truth was both sought and resisted, clarity was elusive, and every decision carried ethical and emotional weight. Amidst this, Harry began to piece together the broader picture. He saw how individual decisions, institutional pressures, and deliberate silencing intersected to create a narrative that had been accepted by the public for decades. The confrontation was not only about accountability. It was about understanding the mechanisms that allowed secrecy to persist, and how he might navigate these forces to ensure the truth would ultimately emerge. It was a lesson in strategy as much as morality, a challenge in both familial and institutional diplomacy. Harry's emotional beats during these confrontations are striking. He recalls moments of profound anger, tempered by empathy and a desire to understand motivations. He recounts episodes of heartbreak when faced with rationalizations that minimized harm, yet also moments of clarity when acknowledgement of mistakes offered a glimpse of potential reconciliation. These fluctuations make the story human, relatable, and dramatically compelling, reinforcing the tension between love and justice, loyalty and morality. The confrontation also had practical dimensions. Harry needed evidence, corroboration, and documentation to support his claims and ensure that the truth could withstand scrutiny. He describes the painstaking process of gathering accounts from staff, reviewing communications, and piecing together inconsistencies in the official narrative. This phase of the confrontation was less about heated exchanges and more about meticulous investigation, highlighting Harry's determination and strategic acumen. Yet, despite preparation, the emotional stakes were ever present. Harry faced moments of isolation, doubt, and fear. Fear of reprisal, fear of misinterpretation, and fear that the truth might never be acknowledged. These moments of vulnerability underscore the personal cost of confronting power, even when one is a prince. It is a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. And just when Harry believed he had exhausted every avenue, another revelation emerged, further intensifying the confrontation. Evidence surfaced indicating that certain decisions, previously rationalized or hidden, were far more deliberate than he had realized. The hush payments, the silenced witnesses, the carefully managed narratives, all pointed to a coordinated effort to control perception. This discovery elevated the confrontation from a personal reckoning to a systemic challenge, forcing Harry to confront not only individual actions but the structural dynamics of the monarchy itself. The climax of this confrontation, as Harry recounts, was both emotional and strategically significant. He realized that speaking alone was insufficient. He needed to ensure that the truth could not be suppressed indefinitely. The confrontation became a catalyst for disclosure, a turning point that ultimately led to the public revelations about hush payments, staff silencing, and the orchestration of narratives surrounding Diana's final night. It was a moment in which personal morality intersected with institutional accountability, creating a dramatic turning point in the story. But just when the confrontation seemed to reach its emotional and strategic peak, Harry uncovered a final, shocking layer. A detail that would redefine the stakes, expose deeper palace involvement, and force the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the tragedy. The confrontation was not over, and the most explosive revelations were still to come.